Greetings to all our learners. Welcome to CEC lecture. Dear learners, the topic of analysis is Neo Marxist Perspectives and International Relations. This lecture shall be of great use for learners preparing for competitive examination, higher education, postgraduate and undergraduate studies in IR, global politics and political theory and political thought. When we try to analyze the neo-Marxist perspective, and as this lecture will go, we shall first look into the key features of Marxism, situate that how from those key features of Marxism in IR, how neo-Marxism emerges, how neo-Marxism adds more to the agenda of global governance, understanding of power, change, transformation, emancipation in international relations. When we try to understand neo-Marxism, it's very important to understand that Marxism as a theoretical perspective, it challenges the traditional perspective, that is the realist perspective, the mainstream perspective, focusing on the status views. It tries to explain the question of global inequalities, power struggle, north-south divide. When we look at Marxism, Marxism no doubt has been challenged with respect to contemporary issues and contemporary events that have come up. But most important aspect, that how within the evolution of the Marxist ideas with respect to international relations, right from starting the work as presented by Lenin and Rosa Luxemburg, wherein the focus was on how imperialism worked as a process which led to the rise of the First World War. Imperialism and this related aspect of inter-imperial rivalry, disintegration of the European empires was one of the causes of First World War, which was a blatant example of power struggle. Related to it was the development of the Marxist perspective in IR, namely via the dependency theory. The core idea that how, when we look at the bigger processes of economically relationships, how they have a bearing on this power struggle in IR, the terms of trade between the economically rich and economically poor nations. When we look at dependency theory, the work of Raul Prebisch, the work of the United Nations Commission on Latin America, how and the remarks of Dos Santos on dependency, wherein it is analyzed as a historical condition which shapes a certain structure of the world economy. Related to the idea of evolution of Marxist perspective in IR was the division of the world as a world economic system divided with respect to core, periphery and semi-periphery, as one can read through the work of Immanuel Wallerstein, wherein in this three-level hierarchy, the world system theory developed by sociologist Immanuel Wallerstein, it approached world history and social change and looking at world economic system wherein some countries benefit at the cost of exploitation of other. Now, dear learners, as we are looking at how Wallerstein emphasized the social structure of global inequality and how related Marxist works also, when we look at the work of Lenin, dependency theory and the world system theory, the remarks by ECLA, all of it, when we look at it, the focus is on the economic aspects. When we look at neo-Marxism, as a critical approach which has been there with respect to an important focus, that is looking at the important aspect of class as a unit of analysis, looking at the important aspect of situating pictures of not just economics. Herein what finds here is that one looks at the aspect of neo-Marxism. Dear learners, neo-Marxism is an extension of the classical Marxist approach of IR, analyzing the context wherein one finds the neo-Marxist work in IR, namely it's the second half of the 20th century. Neo-Marxism and the critical theory, they do not refer to a single theory within the bigger framework of the intellectual tradition of Marxism. What one finds here is plurality, that is, combination of various approaches in the 20th century. When we just saw that how the world system theory, the dependency theory, and as we'll see that with the idea of hegemony presented by Antonio Gramsci, critical theory, the neo-Marxist approaches indeed are having a broad focus. Let's now look at the key point of difference. Marxism and neo-Marxism, when we put these terms together, what distinguishes at the very outset for both of them is the focus. Marxism, the focus is economic determinism. Neo-Marxism, the focus is different, namely, it's much more than economic determinism. It is about inquiry about social and cultural influences that lead to exploitation, domination, and marginalization. When we are looking at the difference perspective, the focus of neo-Marxism is again broad. Class division under the capitalist system is just not about economic determinism of Marxist perspective. The neo-Marxists, via their theoretical inputs, they put an important perspective that one must take into account the political, the cultural related realms also. As we are analyzing neo-Marxism, we first take the work of Antonio Gramsci, the Italian Marxist thinker of early 20th century, who presented the concept of hegemony. Hegemony, now again we have to see that it consists not only of the coercive element but also operates through consent. It is about, as we reflect on the work of Antonio Gramsci, that subtle forms of ideological control and manipulation. The often raised question when we look at Marx's prediction and viability of Marxism as a theoretical idea for global governance is often raised with respect to socialism and the related revolution. That why didn't the Marxian prophecy did not come out true? Why was it difficult to bring revolution in the Western society? Why did the Eastern Europe experiment, which gave space to communism, which did give way for socialism and socialist policies, why did it crumble with time? Now, to answer to these related questions that have been raised with respect to Marxist predictions, prophecies and viability for analysis in future, academicians put forward the explanation presented by Antonio Gramsci, looking at civil society, the educational system, the media, that how it works for exploitative structures that underpin capitalist society. Similarly, dear learners, as we are analyzing the neo-Marxism with respect to IR and looking at hegemony as an important aspect into a tool of explanation presented by Gramsci, hegemony has to be seen that it, as presented in the work, it's a means of support of both force as well as consent. It is a tool to maintain their position or hegemony in international system. Hegemony is a tool through which moral, political, cultural views and values are spread in a whole society and which are also accepted by the oppressed class as their own. So, what we find here is that neo-Marxism in IR, as opposed to the rationalist theories in IR, presents a way for reflectivist forms of social inquiry. When we talk about rationalist theory, it is about realism, neorealism, which are seen as status quo theory. Neo-Marxism as a reflectivist form of social inquiry once again has to be seen in terms of a broad collection of ideas and work of various approaches. When we look at the German theorists collectively known as the Frankfurt School, Richard Ashley, Robert Cox, Andrew Linklater, they also challenge the dominance of the realist issues. Through their works, they brought the focus towards the normative issues, which was hitherto excluded in the analysis of IR. They bring the focus towards emancipation and transformation because unlike the rationalist theories wherein the focus was on preservation of status quo, the reflectivist theory, why they focus on the human agency, normative issues, focus on emancipation, they paved way for transformatory realm both in terms of theory and agency in IR. Robert Cox distinguished between, as we read from his work, traditional or classical and critical theories. Reading from the remarks made by Robert Cox with reference to the work at Devituk's books, that is, these theories are characterized by two features, namely positivist methodology and a tendency to legitimize prevailing social and political structures which are largely unjust. Positivism, as we just read in the quote from Devituk's book, positivism assumption is that is subject and object, values and facts can be separated. The positivist approach in IR, when we look at the realist ideas and when we look at the transition in IR from rationalist to reflectivist, witness us a phase of post-positivism. So therefore, once again looking at the work of Robert Cox, the problem-solving theory as Robert Cox defines, and we read from the work, takes the world as it finds it with the prevailing social and power relations and the institutions into which they are organized as the given framework for action. Example, when we read from Cox's work, Robert Cox's ideas, realism, neorealism are problem-solving theories because they work within the given system. The critical international theory, on the other hand, dear learners, as we are elaborating, once again reading from Cox's perspective, they stand apart from the prevailing order of the world and they question, they ask how that order came about. So most important, what we are seeing here is that cognitive processes are subject to political interests. International relations theory is influenced by social, cultural, ideological factors also, and this is what distinguishes neo-Marxism from the Marxist perspective also. Quoting Richard Ashley here from his work in 1981, that is, knowledge is always constituted in reflection of interest. The critical theory, once again, as we are analyzing the work of Robert Cox, Richard Ashley, one sees that it rejects the positivist distinction, the dichotomy between facts and values, subjects and objects. Robert Cox, as he opined, that theory is always for someone and for some purpose. So what we are saying here is that the neo-Marxist perspective, the critical international theory perspective, as alternative perspectives of international relations, they are just not focusing on the state. When they look at the power-knowledge relation, they indeed add more to the diversity of knowledge with respect the addition made by them, and secondly with respect to broadening the agenda of IR also from the hitherto Marxist idea of the economic aspects. It looks at power knowledge and the related process of norms, ideas, societal aspects as instrument for questioning the established powers. And most important, the emancipatory tenor that comes from the reflectivist theories, from post-positivist work and neo-Marxism thereof, is that the cosmopolitan ideas that aim to promote global freedom, global equality, global justice. So common principles that we are reading, that is emancipation as a principle, as Nancy Fraser has also said two main axes of contemporary political struggles, namely paradigms of redistribution and recognition. Robert Koch's focus is on contemporary redistribution struggles as we go and through his work and look into various analytical points as the work reflects. Andrew Linklater's work is on issues of identity, community, as more significant than economic relations. Some important insights as a book reference that we must take into bearing while analyzing neo-Marxism with respect to IR. The book by Andrew Linklater, that is Beyond Realism and Marxism, Critical Theory and International Relations, Springer, 1990. Dear learners, as we look through this book discusses the challenges to realism by critical theory. It examines the changing relationship between realism and Marxism also, which is indeed very useful for the purpose of our future research, making answers, assignments with respect to neo-Marxism in IR. Another important work presented by Andrew Linklater is that of Critical Theory and World Politics, Citizenship, Sovereignty and Humanity, Routledge 2007. This work, dear learners, attempts to present ideas for radical new theory that calls for a cosmopolitan approach to international relations. As this work, we go by this work, things like citizenship and humanity, critical theory and political community, problem of harm, the sociology of state system, all of it are reflected well in this work by Andrew Linklater. An important another work that is by Claude V. Barrow, Critical Theories of the State, the Marxist, Neo-Marxist, Post-Marxist, presented by University of Wisconsin Press, 1993. Now, these critical theories of the state, they are radical perspectives on the modern state, focus on the Marxist theory and its variations, particularly as applied to advanced industrial societies and contemporary welfare states. This work by Claude W. Barrow, it divides the methodological assumption and the key hypothesis of the Marxist, Neo-Marxist, Post-Marxist theories into 5 distinct approaches, and as we read from the book, instrumentalist, structuralist, derivationist, systems analytics and organizational realist. Andrew Artaud's work, that is From Neo-Marxism to Democratic Theory, essays on the critical theory of Soviet-type societies. It looks, essays, when we look at this work by Andrew Artaud, Routledge 2016, it looks at Soviet socialism, contemporary global social movements, somewhere as a critique of Marxism for the reconstruction of democratic theory based on civil society rather than just class categories. So, dear learners, what we find here is that all the works, that we read with respect to as presented by Andrew Linklater, with respect to presented by Andrew Artaud and Claude W. Barrow, and a very important work that one must refer to, that is by Marcos Farias Ferreira, introducing critical theory in IR, that is at eir.info. So what we get here is that as an important aspect that we must look into, that Marxism no doubt presented significant inputs with respect to international relations. Marxism did broaden the agenda of international relations. But when we look at the Marxist ideas, namely with the focus on economic aspects from the conventional ones that is presented by Lenin and Rosa Luxemburg, linking imperialism and capitalism, to its later development in the work of ideas of dependency theory, the world system theory presented by Immanuel Wallerstein, with time Marxism also witnessed a change. And herein we find Neo-Marxism as a perspective which extended the classical Marxist approaches and ideas with respect to IR. One has to look at that Neo-Marxism is not a single theory within the broad framework of intellectual idea of Marxism, but rather it is a combination of various approaches, drawing from the idea of hegemony to critical theory. The key difference between Marxism and Neo-Marxism is the focus. The focus of Marxist perspective is on economic determinism. Neo-Marxism rather is on a broad and a diverse field of trajectory of analysis, namely inquiry about social and cultural influences that lead to the bigger perspective of exploitation, domination and marginalization. Further, when we look at class division under the process of capitalism, under the bigger picture of power struggle, Neo-Marxism, is seen as an emancipatory theory. Critical theory is seen as a transformative theory because they try to understand not only the issue of division, the struggle and domination, but also look at possibility of change via focus on the bigger human agency societal perspective. When we look at the work of Antonio Gramsci with the concept of hegemony, how hegemony was a tool of moral, political, cultural views and values, and how this tool of domination is reworked via the work of the Frankfurt School and amongst others. So what we see that as we reflect on the work of Robert Cox, reflecting on this dichotomy between positivism and post-positivism, Neo-Marxism indeed talks about a leap in terms of both analysis as well as a leap in terms of perspectives of transformation with respect to IR. When we look at the work of critical theorists, when we look at the work of Andrew Linklater, Richard Ashley, this entire dichotomy between subject and object, facts and values, and this issue of reflectivism in IR, post-positivism in IR, indeed presents significant insights for all of us to benefit, to take into account for further analysis with respect to the idea of alternative perspectives in IR by just not focusing on the state, looking at the power-knowledge relation, looking at the bigger picture of values, ideas, theories, norms for questioning established power, and above all looking at cosmopolitan ideas to work out aspects of global freedom, equality and justice. So dear learners, when we look at Neo-Marxism in IR, it's very important to take into account all these related aspects. We hope that the lecture on Neo-Marxist perspectives in IR gave you significant important insights to understand the changing dynamics of not only paradigms of redistribution and recognition and contemporary political struggles, but also the bigger picture of changing reality of global issues. Dear learners, we hope that you gained significant insights. We hope to look forward to positive feedback from you all for the lecture. Thank you very much for being with us for the lecture.